Long before Edmund Emil Kemper became known as the co-ed killer, before the headlines, the photographs, and the grisly details of his crimes, there was a boy who lived in shadows. His life began in Burbank, California, in 1948, a place that seemed unremarkable, yet within its walls a storm was forming. From the start, Edmund's world was fractured. His father, a World War II veteran named Edmund Sr., left when the boy was young, worn down by a bitter marriage. The absence of a father left a void, and into that void stepped Clarnell, his mother, a towering, sharp-tongued woman whose voice could slice through silence like glass. She did not see a son. She saw a reflection of the man who abandoned her, and she despised it. Neighbors would sometimes catch the tension in that house. Clarnell spoke openly of her disappointment. "That boy is strange," she would say, her tone cold, dismissive. "Mark my words, he's going to be trouble." These were not warnings spoken with concern, but verdicts passed on a child who could do nothing to change his fate. Edmund grew fast, both in body and in mind. By the time he was 10, he was already tall, awkwardly towering over his classmates. His intelligence was sharp, restless. He took things apart, clocks, radios, toys, not out of malice but curiosity, a need to understand. But curiosity often found no safe outlet in that house. Clarnell believed the boy was dangerous. Perhaps she saw something in his quiet, watchful eyes, or perhaps she needed a scapegoat for her own bitterness. When she was angry, and she was often angry, she would send him to the basement. It was a place of punishment, a dark, airless room that smelled of damp wood and mildew. The boy would sit for hours, listening to footsteps above, each creak and groan of the floorboards a reminder of his isolation. She told him it was to protect his sisters, to keep them safe from whatever he might do. Whether she truly feared him or only wanted to break him, no one could say. Loneliness became his only companion. At school, he was quiet, withdrawn, the boy who sat at the back of the classroom. At home, he learned that love was conditional, fleeting, and often cruel. The world taught him to be invisible. But in that invisibility, something began to grow. There were small, troubling signs, the way he would linger over thoughts of control, the fascination with death that flickered in his mind like a secret flame. It began with animals, silent, private experiments that no one saw. The first fleeting images of harm, of escape, of control. One evening, long before anyone called him a monster, the boy stood outside his mother's bedroom door, a kitchen knife clutched in his hand. He didn't move. He only stood there, trembling, listening to her breathing on the other side. Something deep inside him stirred, but he turned away. Not tonight, not yet. The world would not remember this boy, but one day it would remember what he became. By the time Edmund Kemper reached his early teens, the darkness inside him was no longer content to stay quiet. It simmered under the surface, hidden behind a calm face and a deep, methodical mind. To anyone passing him on the street, he might have seemed awkward but harmless, a tall, gangly boy with too much intelligence and too little warmth. But behind his quiet eyes, something was beginning to wake. The turning point came at 15. By then, Edmund had grown restless, angry at the world and at his mother, who seemed to delight in reminding him of his failures. Clarnell still punished him with words sharper than knives, still locked him in the basement when she didn't trust him. She told friends and neighbors that she feared him, but she never truly believed he would fight back. She was wrong. When Edmund moved in with his paternal grandparents in the rural hills of North Fork, California, it seemed like a reprieve. Away from his mother's cruelty, there was a chance, at least on the surface, for peace. But life with Maud and Edmund Kemper Sr. was lonely and rigid. His grandfather was a strict man, quiet and proud. His grandmother, Maud, was strong-willed, outspoken, and often critical. She scolded Edmund frequently, corrected him sharply, and sometimes belittled him in small but cutting ways. To a boy already bruised by years of emotional wounds, those moments cut deeper than anyone realized. The farm itself was quiet, isolated, surrounded by fields and scattered trees. There was nothing but time to think, to brood, to feed the silent anger that had been planted long ago. He spent his days reading, hunting, wandering the land, but the tension with his grandmother grew. Her words reminded him too much of his mother, and each reprimand felt like another stone on his chest. It was on a warm August afternoon in 1964 that the tension finally broke. Edmund had been arguing with Maud over some trivial matter, something about his chores, about responsibility. The details would blur later, but the feeling stayed sharp. She had told him once again that he couldn't do anything right, that he was wasting his life. He stood there, a rifle in his hands, and something in him shifted. The world seemed to narrow into a tunnel, scattering into the sky. Maud Kemper fell instantly, her body crumpling to the floor of the kitchen. Blood spread across the linoleum, a vivid, shocking red. Edmund did not panic. In later years, he would say it almost felt like an experiment, a test of something he had always imagined but never done. As he stared at her body, he claimed he wanted to see what it felt like. When his grandfather returned home a short while later, carrying groceries, Edmund was waiting. He knew the old man would be heartbroken, perhaps furious. He also knew he didn't want him to see Maud's body. So as his grandfather stepped out of the car, Edmund lifted the rifle again and shot him too. There was no escape plan, no attempt to run. The boy who had just killed two of the only people who had taken him in simply stood there in the quiet, the smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. He looked at what he had done, and for a moment there was only silence. Then, with the same strange calm, he picked up the phone and called his mother. "I just killed Grandma and Grandpa," he said, as if announcing something ordinary. Clarnell, stunned, told him to call the police, and he did. The authorities found Edmund waiting on the porch when they arrived, the rifle set aside. He surrendered without struggle. There was no sign of remorse, only a strange detachment. When questioned later, he told psychiatrists that he had just wanted to know what it felt like to kill Grandma, and that killing his grandfather was an act of mercy. He didn't want the old man to suffer the shock of seeing his wife dead. This was no ordinary 15-year-old. His IQ would later be measured at 145, a mind far beyond his years. Yet his emotional world was a fractured landscape, rage buried under ice, empathy frozen into something unrecognizable. The courts would deem him unstable, and the boy was sent to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for the criminally insane. There, doctors would test him, study him, even train him as a clerk in the psychiatric records office. He read the files of rapists, murderers, and psychopaths, learning from them, absorbing details. To some, he was the model patient, polite, cooperative, intelligent. But inside, the darkness remained, patient and quiet, waiting for its chance to return. The first blood had been spilled, and though the world thought it had contained him, Edmund Kemper was only beginning to understand what he was capable of. When Edmund Kemper walked out of Atascadero State Hospital at 21,
the world thought it was giving a young man a second chance. His psychiatric reports were glowing, cooperative, intelligent, even helpful. The doctors believed he had been rehabilitated. They were wrong. The darkness had not been cured, it had been refined. Back home, the old wounds reopened. He returned to his mother, Clarnell, who had moved to Santa Cruz. Their relation
berated him, mocked his failed attempts at independence. She reminded him constantly that no woman would ever want him. "You're just like your father," she'd say. Those words burned, feeding the same resentment that had driven him to kill before. But Edmund was no longer the awkward, isolated boy. He was a man now, 6'9", broad-shouldered, with a calm, almost polite demeanor that masked the storm inside. He was learning to control the mask, to hide behind it. And behind the smile, a plan began to take shape. Santa Cruz in the early 1970s was a college town, alive with students, hitchhikers, and freedom. It was the perfect hunting ground. Young women stood on street corners with backpacks and guitars, thumbing rides, trusting strangers. The culture was open, naive, and Edmund knew it. His mind, sharp and methodical, studied the patterns. He made changes to his car, removing the interior door handles so passengers couldn't escape. He kept weapons hidden, guns, knives, plastic bags. He practiced his approach, his voice calm and reassuring. "Where are you headed? Hop in, I'll give you a lift." The first two were 19-year-old students, Marianne Pesch and Anita Lucchesa. It was May 1972 when he spotted them thumbing a ride near Berkeley. They climbed into his car without hesitation. Edmund chatted easily, his deep voice steady, his demeanor harmless. He took them far from campus, into the remote hills. What happened there was brutal. He overpowered them, strangling and stabbing, his size giving him an almost inhuman advantage. He hid their bodies, dismembering them later, keeping parts as trophies. It was not just killing, it was control, curiosity, possession. In August of that same year, he struck again. A 15-year-old girl named Aiko Ku was hitchhiking to a dance class when he offered her a ride. She trusted him. Why wouldn't she? He looked calm, almost shy. He drove her out of town, pulled a gun, and bound her. What followed was cold and methodical. She begged, but Edmund's voice remained even. He killed her and took her body home, where his mother slept upstairs, oblivious. This became his ritual. He hunted, he killed, and he returned to his mother's house, parking in the driveway, as if nothing was wrong. Inside, in his room, the dead were reduced to objects, studied and manipulated. He photographed them, violated them, dissected them. And then, when his curiosity was, mother's voice echoed in his mind with every act, a reminder of rejection and humiliation. To him, these women became symbols, strangers who carried the weight of his rage. He escalated. That February, he picked up two students, Cindy Shaw and Rosalind Thorpe, both friendly and unsuspecting. He killed them swiftly, then brought their bodies home. As his mother slept, he carried them inside, moving quietly through the dark hallway. It was almost ordinary to him now. In those moments, Edmund Kemper seemed less like a man and more like an instrument of his own unresolved pain. Behind the closed door of his bedroom, the line between curiosity and cruelty dissolved. He was no longer just experimenting. He was mastering. By the spring of 1973, Edmund Kemper's secret world was spiraling closer to its center. He had stalked and killed 6 young women, evading suspicion with a calm, almost charming facade. But the hunt was changing. The more he killed, the more the anger inside him circled back to its source. His mother, Clarnell. She was still there, a constant storm in his life. Clarnell's house in Santa Cruz was small but suffocating, filled with sharp words and old resentments. She drank at night, criticizing him with a bitter tongue. She told friends, half joking, that she worried about her son. "He's odd," she'd say. "Sometimes I think he could kill me." To Edmund, these comments were salt in a wound that had never healed. Every murder had been a rehearsal, a shadow of the confrontation he dreaded and craved. He often said later that his rage toward women was rooted in years of belittlement, rejection, and humiliation, all embodied by Clarnell. By 1973, it was no longer enough to take strangers. The voice he heard most clearly was hers, echoing in his head long after she stopped speaking. The breaking point came on the night of April 20th, 1973. Clarnell was at home, reading in bed after a long day of drinking. Edmund had been out, driving, but came home late. She heard him enter, and as he recalled later, she made a casual, cutting remark. "I suppose you're going to sit up all night and talk to me." It was nothing extraordinary, just another barb, another dismissal. But something inside him hardened. He waited until she fell asleep. The house was quiet, except for the rhythmic sound of her breathing. Edmund entered her room, massive and silent, a hammer in his hand. He struck her, once, twice, Hallett, inviting her over. When she arrived the next morning, cheerful and unsuspecting, Edmund greeted her at the door and killed her swiftly. He had staged a final performance, one last cruel twist. The aftermath was strangely calm. For 2 days he stayed in the house with the bodies. He drank, he thought. He seemed almost relieved, but the weight of his actions was sinking in. He knew this was the end. There would be no going back. The game, the hunts, the experiments, they had all led here, to the silencing of the woman he both hated and, in a twisted way, needed. On the evening of April 23rd, Edmund packed his car and began to drive. South, then east, across the state. He left Santa Cruz behind and headed for Colorado, then Utah. Somewhere along that long, lonely drive, the mask finally cracked. He called the police from a payphone in Pueblo, Colorado. His voice was calm. "I killed my mother," he said. "I killed her friend." The dispatcher thought it was a prank. They knew Edmund, after all. He was friendly with local officers, but he called again, more insistent. "I'm the one you're looking for. I'm the co-ed killer." When the news broke, Santa Cruz reeled. The polite, tall man who had shared coffee with detectives, who had chatted with students, had been a predator all along. And at the heart of it all was not just the strangers he'd murdered, but the mother who had given him life, and who, in his mind, had taken something from him long before he took hers. When the call came through from Pueblo, Colorado, the Santa Cruz authorities were skeptical. Edmund Kemper, the polite, intelligent giant who often drank coffee with local deputies? It seemed absurd. But the voice on the phone was steady, eerily calm. "I killed my mother," he said again, "and her friend. You need to come get me." 2 officers flew to Pueblo. When they arrived at the small station, they found Edmund sitting quietly, almost relieved. He greeted them as if they were old friends. There was no chase, no resistance. The man they had been searching for, the one who had terrorized a community, handed himself over without a fight. During the ride back to California, Edmund talked. He talked more than most killers ever do. In a matter-of-fact tone, he described the murders, the women he picked up, the trust he broke, the way he hid weapons in his car. He explained how he modified the doors so victims couldn't escape, how he carried bodies home to dissect them, sometimes to desecrate them. He spoke without hesitation, as if the weight of secrecy had finally lifted.
Who interviewed him. With an IQ measured at 145, Edmund was articulate, even thoughtful. He seemed to analyze his own actions with detachment, describing impulses, fantasies, and emotions as if they belonged to someone else. "I just wanted to see what it would feel like," he said of his first killings. "I wanted to possess them completely." The details shocked even hardened investigators. He admitted to photographing victims, keeping parts of them, sometimes talking to severed heads. Yet he never sounded frenzied. If anything, there was a cold curiosity in his tone, a man studying his own darkness. At trial, there was little drama. Edmund waived the insanity defense, telling his lawyers and the court that he wanted to take responsibility. "I'm not insane," he said. "I know what I did." The jury listened to the calm descriptions of horror, and the verdict was inevitable. 8 counts of first-degree murder. In November 1973, the judge sentenced Edmund Emil Kemper III to life imprisonment. He was sent to California Medical Facility in Vacaville, a place designed for men who were dangerous but lucid. Behind bars, Kemper remained the same unsettling mix of intelligence and menace. He read voraciously, worked with prison programs, and even volunteered to record audiobooks for the blind, his deep, calm voice reading children's stories and novels. But to those who knew what he had done, the image was chilling. The man who once hunted women, now reading fairy tales. Over the years, Kemper gave interviews, speaking with an openness rare among killers. He analyzed himself, often blaming his mother, sometimes blaming loneliness, sometimes admitting that he enjoyed the power. "When I see a pretty girl walking down the street," he once said, "I wonder what it would be like to meet her, and what she would look like dead." The world never forgot him. His case became a grim study in criminal psychology, a story of intelligence twisted by pain, of a boy broken long before he became a man. And perhaps the most haunting detail was the ordinariness of it all. He was not a shadow in an alley, not a stranger in a mask. He was the quiet man with a kind voice, the one you might have trusted for a ride. For all his intellect, for all his calm, Edmund Kemper's legacy is one of control, rage, and loss. The boy who lived in basements, who craved love and found none, became a man who turned that void into violence. When asked once why he turned himself in, he said something simple, almost weary. "I was done. I couldn't do it anymore. It had to stop." But the truth is, the echo of his crimes never stopped. They remain, a reminder that monsters can hide behind gentle faces, that the darkest minds can speak softly, and that sometimes the scary